Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us from Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
This is a ludicrous situation. You don't fund the UN at proper levels, therefore it can't execute the programs it's supposed to, and then you claw back money you didn't send the UN in the first place from the UN.
Welcome to Save Us from Hell. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist who covers the United Nations, and I run Global Dispatches, which hosts this very podcast.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
So, Anjali, lots to discuss this week. We have a new entrant to the race for Secretary General. We have the UN caught up in the blast radius of the recent Epstein documents release. And we have a really dire warning from António Guterres, essentially saying that if they don't get new money by the summer, the UN is just going to close its doors, that they're out of money.
It's going to be out of money in July.
And of course, right at the top, I'm going to ask you to get a paying subscription so you can listen to our entire episode. You can do so at globaldispatches.org/40% off. That's the number 40, the word percent, and the word off. And I'll post a link to that in the show notes of this episode. But let's get started with the big news this week that Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, has been nominated for Secretary General. And what makes her nomination so unique, Anjali, that as far as I can tell, it is the first time in the history of the world that more than one country has nominated someone to become Secretary General. Her nomination was announced jointly by Chile, her home country, Brazil, and Mexico.
That's right. Gabriel Boric of Chile had nominated her informally from the UNGA rostrum when he was speaking in September, but her formal nomination came this week, as you said, from the governments of Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. In this race, each country can nominate only one candidate, but more than one country can nominate a single candidate. And essentially what Brazil, Mexico, and Chile are doing is that they are demonstrating their shared will to put Michelle Bachelet in the Secretary General seat, and in theory, papering over some of the assumed competition there might be among Latin American countries to advance their candidate, since Latin America and the Caribbean is the most likely region to produce a Secretary General candidate. So this is a big, strong show of support for her, particularly because many, including myself, speculated that the change in the Chilean government after the last election meant that they wouldn't necessarily enthusiastically support her nomination. But that turns out not to be the case.
And I think it's interesting that Brazil and Mexico, they are regional heavyweights. They are the big players in the Latin American and Caribbean region in the UN system. And them throwing their weight behind Michelle Bachelet, I think, sends a very strong message that this might be the candidate from Latin America. But of course, there are others that are already announced or are expected to be announced from the region as well, including Rafael Grossi of Argentina, who was announced, Rebecca Greenspan of Costa Rica, who we expect will announce soon. But this was, I think, geopolitically significant for the fact that it was those two major countries in the region.
You know, in his post on social media nominating Michelle Bachelet, Gabriel Boric wrote, former President Michelle Bachelet faithfully embodies the values of the United Nations, and this candidacy expresses a shared hope that Latin America and the Caribbean make their voice heard in building collective solutions to the tremendous challenges of our time. With this shared commitment to the defense of democracy, global governance, multilateralism, and human rights, from Latin America, we continue to believe in an international system that can and must be capable of responding with greater effectiveness, legitimacy, and humanity to the great problems of the world, a source of pride for Chile. There's also a statement from Lula of Brazil, who said that it's time for there to be a woman Secretary General of the United Nations. And he wrote, her experience, leadership, and commitment to multilateralism qualify her to lead the UN at a time when the international context is marked by conflicts, inequalities, and democratic setbacks. And in these sort of big pitches, one of the things I think we see is an effort to counter the big trends of the day in thinking about like what's going to happen next at the United Nations. The race looked like it was going to go one way before Donald Trump was elected, and then it looked like it was going to go a whole other way. The nomination of Michelle Bachelet and then the continued affirmation of her nomination from now what are ideologically diverse countries, even if the governments remain the same for the moment, is a strong signal. This is a center left coalition of nominators at the moment. She will continue to be Chile's candidate even after the government switches over to a right wing government. The shared statement on human rights, values, multilateralism is, I think, a strong signal that they want her to go far in this race, regardless of what the domestic politics of the region look like.
I think it's worth maybe taking a moment talking about really her extraordinary biography and resume. I'll start with just like the resume. She was president of Chile from 2006 to 2010. In 2010, she became the first head of UN Women for a few years. The agency had just been created at the United Nations at the time. Then she went back to becoming president of Chile from 2014 to 2018. Then, after she left her second stint as president of Chile, she became High Commissioner for Human Rights. So she has just, extensive UN experience as well as political acumen, which is, I think, a combination that would serve anyone well in that role. But her biography to me is even more fascinating.
Yeah.
Her father was an official in Salvador Allende's government when the Pinochet coup happened. Her father was abducted and tortured to death in one of Pinochet's prisons. She and her mother were also abducted and tortured. She was able somehow to escape, get out, one way or another, flee to Australia, then came back to Chile, became a medical doctor, a surgeon, and worked her way into the health ministry as in doing epidemiology, eventually became the Minister of Defense for Chile, and became like a high-flying politician in Chile. So she's got the chops.
Yeah, in her biography, in her person, we have this remarkable figure of someone who is both a former head of state and the former victim of human rights abuses. And the former head of state, right? That's something we have currently in António Guterres. The hope there is that you have someone who can speak to their peer executives, who can speak to their peer states as someone who knows what it is to lead a state, to seek its national interest. But in the form of someone who herself has been a victim of human rights abuses, we also have someone who understands what the abuses of state power look like and who can perhaps uniquely among candidates for Secretary General understand what that second architecture of the UN system is, not just the compact between states, but also the body of law and agreements and norms and values that underwrite the sovereignty of each person, the sort of doctrine of human rights that sits alongside the UN Charter. And that I think is very unusual. I know there were human rights activists who were disappointed by her tenure as UN's High Commission for Human Rights. I think that says as much about the impossibility of that position as it does about the sort of way she fulfilled it. Not to say that there aren't always ways to do it better, but it is a strange position that's fundamentally hamstrung in some ways. And I understand why human rights activists were disappointed in some of her tenure. But I do think it is notable that she brings this dual and shared experience that we actually have never seen before in this position. We've had previous recipients of UN aid and intervention, right? This was a notable part of Ban Ki-moon's biography.
That he, as a child, like received UN aid in the context of the Korean War
Yeah.
to use UN humanitarian assistance to like get him through his early days. He cited that often
Yeah.
in discussing, his affinity for the UN.
I think that's notable. That tells us something about the kind of commitment that he had to the organization more broadly. I think in her, it's a rare thing to see someone ascend to this kind of position with a personal history and a personal stake, perhaps, in these often easily sidelined bodies of UN work.
So, of course, to become Secretary General, you need to run through the Security Council, where 5 countries have a veto, including the United States, led by Donald Trump. I've seen some chatter, and this is new, so it's still just chatter, that because 2 people that have somewhat hostile relations with Donald Trump at the moment, Lula and Steinbaum of Mexico, are the ones nominating her, that might somehow impede her ability to get past the Trump roadblock. But honestly, I don't buy that. You look at just how maybe mercurial Trump is
Yeah.
with his personal relations to foreign leaders and how those things can like change on a dime. Like earlier this week, I think actually the same day that Bachelet was nominated by Lula and Steinbaum of Mexico, Gustavo Petro of Colombia was in the White House. Just a few weeks ago, Trump basically like threatened Petro with doing to him what he did to Maduro. But there you had Petro in the White House, chummy with Trump, all smiles.
Yeah.
So to me, I don't think the kind of Trump roadblock is as significant as others might in terms of like handicapping her chances.
I agree with you. She's also very personally charismatic. And for him, that is like, if you can make him laugh and make him feel important, there's a bridge in Brooklyn, he will sell you. But I think the bigger challenge to her candidacy is actually going to be the Chinese government, the Chinese delegation. There was a May 2022 report, her last month as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, about the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And there was a lot of back and forth about that report. And, eventually it did come out and document systematic abuses by the Chinese government. There was some slight pulling of punches in terms of the actual language that was in the report, but the substance of the report was not what the Chinese government wanted. And they were very upset about that. I am not sure that makes her a candidate that could survive the Security Council. I do think that is not going to hurt her chances with any of the other permanent members. If anything, it might strengthen it. But of course, every one of those permanent members has its own blackball. So I don't know. I think you're right. I think there's no a priori reason to suggest that Donald Trump will automatically be hostile to her. But I also actually do think that if we're looking at a diplomatic delegation with more stable interests than Donald Trump, there's a bigger reason to suspect that there's going to be opposition, at least initially, from the Chinese government.
And we'll just see like whether her political skills enable her to overcome that. But though, speaking about handicapping the race, Anjali, the prediction markets have caught on to what we've been talking about for the last several months or so and are starting to create markets to determine, to handicap who might be the next UN Secretary General. I'm looking at one right now at Kalshi, and it has Rafael Grossi as the front runner with a 37% chance, followed by Mia Motley at 18%, then Rebecca Greenspan at 16%, and then a few others. Right now, Bachelet is at 11%.
Interesting.
What's fascinating actually to me about this list is that Amina Mohammed is on the list at 12%. She's the Deputy Secretary General right now. Potentially, I don't know, maybe she's like a consensus candidate if everyone else falls through. But it's, I think, notable, number one, that Grossi is the front runner according to prediction markets, which I don't put a lot of stock in. But it's also just interesting to see that this is kind of becoming a little more, I think, publicly known about what's happening at the UN.
Yeah. I guess this is time for me to debut my most puritanical opinion on this podcast, which is that I don't think people should be allowed to bet on most things, but especially real world political events, which strikes me as an abomination. I mean, okay, maybe that's strong language, but it's a bad thing. What it does show us, though, as you say, is that this is actually interesting to people. It's
Yeah.
getting traction. It is breaking through the UN sphere. Either that or there are like 20 people within the UN system who are about to like break open the piggy banks and do all of the betting.
Do you think we could like move the market in a profitable way? This podcast can pay for itself.
Again, my most puritanical opinion.
I will not. So speaking about unethical things, Anjali, the UN, not as an institution, but diplomats in the UN orbit have, as I said earlier, been caught in the blast radius of the recent Epstein documents dump. I think the names involved and the circumstances of the entire saga here, tragic saga, is, I think kind of revealing about the United Nations as a whole, even though, again, like the UN as an institution is not caught up, but individuals around the UN are in ways that I think are interesting and obviously very tragic as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.